At Thanksgiving dinner, my sister discovered I had $15 million. The holiday celebration came to a screeching halt as my entire family surrounded me, insisting I hand the money over to her because she, quote, deserved it more, end quote. They expected me to shrink down, accept my place at the bottom of the family hierarchy, and give in exactly like I always did. I stayed completely silent. Then I reached into my designer bag and pulled out something that left every single one of them absolutely speechless. My name is Nia. I am 29 years old, and this is the story of how I took back my power and exposed the toxic foundation my family was built upon. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who severely underestimated your worth and tried to tear you down to make themselves feel taller. Growing up, our historic brownstone in Atlanta was the center of our universe. My parents, Marcus and Valerie, prided themselves on projecting the absolute perfect image of Black excellence to our community. They hosted lavish parties, attended every prominent church event, and ensured that everyone saw us as the flawless, successful family. But behind those heavy carved oak doors, the reality was entirely different. My older sister, Chloe, was the undeniable golden child, the one whose every minor achievement was celebrated with grand gestures. I, on the other hand, was the designated disappointment. No matter how hard I worked, my efforts were always met with critical eyes and dismissive sighs. This Thanksgiving was supposed to be a simple, joyful family cookout. I arrived at the brownstone carrying a large steaming tray of my signature baked macaroni and cheese. It was a cherished family recipe passed down from our grandmother, something I had spent hours carefully perfecting just for this occasion. I walked into the grand dining room, the scent of melted cheese and rich spices filling the air, and set the heavy glass dish down on the center of the massive marble table. For a brief second, I felt a genuine moment of pride. I thought maybe this year we could just enjoy a normal holiday. That pride vanished in an instant, crushed by the casual cruelty I was so accustomed to. Liam, Chloe's white husband, walked into the room and stopped at the table. He wrinkled his nose in disgust, as if I had just placed absolute garbage right in front of him. With a loud, exaggerated scrape that echoed off the high ceilings, he pushed my glass dish away, sliding it to the very edge of the marble table, where it nearly tipped over and crashed to the floor. He let out a harsh, condescending laugh and looked around the room to make sure he had an audience. "Nia, did you seriously buy these cheap ingredients at some discount grocery store?" he asked, his voice booming loud enough for the entire living room to hear. You know Chloe's stomach is incredibly sensitive lately. She simply cannot process cheap food made by a failure. We only eat premium organic ingredients now. Take this away before it ruins the aesthetic of the dinner. I stood there frozen, my hands still warm from carrying the heavy dish, staring at the man who had just brutally insulted me in my own childhood home. The chatter in the adjacent living room grew quiet. I could feel the eyes of my relatives on me, but nobody stepped forward to defend me. Not a single person told him he was out of line. Right on cue, Chloe glided into the dining room, her expensive heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She linked her arm through Liam's and offered me a sickeningly sweet, condescending smile that I had hated since we were children. "Do not be too hard on her." Liam, Chloe chimed in, her voice dripping with fake sympathy that felt like poison. "Nia is just struggling right now. You cannot blame her for cutting corners when she is completely broke and trying to survive on pennies." She turned her gaze fully to me, looking me up and down with obvious disdain, taking in my outfit and my presence as if I were a stain on her perfect day. "Really, Nia, what did you expect when you foolishly threw away a perfectly good, stable career in corporate media? You gave up a steady paycheck, health insurance, and a respectable title to make homemade lotions in your kitchen." It is honestly embarrassing for all of us. Starting a cosmetics brand for Black women sounds cute for a little hobby, but you are playing store like a child. You have no real money, no investors, and absolutely no future. It is time to wake up, swallow your pride, and get a real job before mom and dad have to dip into their savings to bail you out again. In the past, I would have lowered my eyes, quietly apologized for causing a scene, and retreated to the kitchen to cry in secret. I had spent 29 years swallowing my pride to keep the peace, constantly adjusting myself to make them feel bigger. But the woman standing in front of them today was not the same broken, insecure girl they remembered. I did not shed a single tear. My heart was pounding, but my mind was crystal clear. I let out a low, steady laugh that caught them completely off guard. I locked eyes with Liam, letting my gaze drop deliberately and slowly to his left wrist. Playing store, I asked, my voice calm but sharp enough to cut glass. That is a very interesting observation, Chloe. Almost as interesting as your husband's taste in luxury jewelry. Tell me, Liam, does your highly sensitive stomach bother you when you wear a fake watch? Liam's smug smile faltered instantly. He instinctively covered his left wrist with his right hand, a defensive gesture that told me everything I needed to know. I have no idea what you are talking about, he stammered, his face turning a blotchy shade of red. This is a genuine Rolex. I bought it last month. I took a deliberate step closer to him, not breaking eye contact for a second. Please, I said smoothly, letting my words echo in the silent room. The sweeping motion of the second hand stutters terribly, and the magnification over the date window is entirely wrong. You bought that super fake on the black market to look the part of a highly successful investor. But we both know the ugly truth, do we not? Your supposedly elite cryptocurrency firm has been bleeding money for 6 straight months. You are teetering on the absolute edge of total bankruptcy, Liam. My homemade lotions paid for the exclusive designer shoes I am wearing right now, while your entire life is built on maxed-out credit cards and desperate lies. The color drained completely from Liam's face. Chloe gasped loudly, her hand flying to her chest in mock horror as she looked from me to her husband's wrist. Before either of them could formulate a coherent response, heavy, furious footsteps echoed from the hallway. My father Marcus stormed into the dining room with my mother Valerie trailing right behind him. They had heard the entire exchange from the living room. Nia, that is more than enough, my father bellowed, pointing a stern, trembling finger directly at my face. How dare you speak to your brother-in-law that way in this house? Have you lost your mind? I looked at my father in sheer disbelief. He insulted me first. Dad, I replied, my voice steady. He pushed my food away, mocked my financial status, and called me a failure right to my face, My mother stepped forward, her face twisted in a familiar scowl of deep disappointment. I do not care who started it, she snapped, waving her hand dismissively at my explanation. Liam is a respected businessman, and you are embarrassing this entire family with your petty childish jealousy. You have always been deeply resentful of your sister's perfect life and her successful marriage. You are just trying to drag them down because you are unhappy with your own choices. My father crossed his arms, stepping up to stand shoulder to shoulder with the man who had just publicly humiliated me. You will apologize to Liam right now. Nia, he demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. We have important guests arriving soon, including our pastor and several prominent community leaders. I will not have your negative energy and your bitter attitude ruining this holiday and damaging our family image. Apologize to him immediately, or you can turn around and leave. I stood there looking at the unified front they had formed against me. My mother, with her perfectly styled hair and expensive pearls, glaring at me with absolute contempt. My father, a man who cared more about what the neighbors thought than his own daughter's feelings, protecting a liar. And Chloe holding on to a man who was quietly bankrupting them, wearing a smirk of victory because Mom and Dad had rushed to her defense yet again. They expected me to break. They expected the old Nia to surface, the one who would choke back her tears, say she was sorry, and spend the rest of the evening serving them drinks just to be allowed to stay. The old Nia would have done anything to feel like part of the family. But as I looked at their angry, entitled faces, I realized I did not want to be part of this family anymore. I was not the scapegoat they could kick around to make themselves feel superior. I took a deep breath, preparing to give them an answer they would never forget, when a sudden commotion from the living room interrupted us. Chloe had carelessly left my designer handbag unattended on the sofa, and what was about to happen next would change the power dynamic of our family forever. "What is this?" Nia Chloe's shrill voice pierced through the tense air of the dining room. She marched in from the living room, her face flushed a blotchy red, her manicured fingers clutching a thick stack of stapled watermarked papers. She had completely bypassed my privacy, digging straight to the bottom of my bag the moment she thought everyone was distracted. She slammed the document onto the marble table right next to the untouched turkey. The bold black letters at the top of the page seemed to scream at the entire room. It was a formal term sheet from the Corporate Acquisitions Division of L'Oreal. It outlined their binding offer to purchase my cosmetics brand in its entirety. The valuation, printed in plain, undeniable ink, was $15 million. All cash. The silence that fell over the dining room was so absolute it felt suffocating. The air seemed to vanish from the room. My father lowered his pointing finger, the anger draining from his face, only to be replaced by sheer, unadulterated shock. My mother stepped forward, her eyes widening as she snatched the heavy document from the table. Her eyes darted back and forth across the pages, reading the numbers over and over, as if trying to prove it was some kind of elaborate prank. But it was not a prank. It was legal binding and very real. I watched her lips part, waiting for the words I had craved my entire life. I waited for her to say she was proud of me, that I had achieved something incredible, that her outcast daughter had built an empire all on her own. Instead, her face contorted into a mask of absolute fury. She slammed her hand down on the marble so hard the crystal glasses rattled. "You kept this from us!" Valerie screamed, her voice cracking with indignation. "You have been sitting on $15 million while this family has been suffering. We are drowning in debt. Your father and I are biting our nails every single month just to pay the mortgage on this historic house, and you are hiding a fortune in your purse. How could you be so incredibly selfish?" I simply crossed my arms and watched them. I did not blink. I did not apologize. I just stood there, taking in the breathtaking audacity of a mother who had just allowed me to be publicly degraded, now demanding my money as if it were her birthright. The shift in the room was instantaneous and entirely sickening. Liam, the man who had just pushed my food aside and called me a penniless failure, not 2 minutes prior, completely changed his posture. He cleared his throat, straightening his posture, and suddenly put on his most polished, persuasive businessman persona. The disdain completely vanished from his eyes, replaced by a hungry, desperate greed. "Nia, let us all take a deep breath here," Liam said, his voice suddenly smooth and reasonable. "Let us look at the bigger picture. You have done incredibly well for yourself, and we are all very impressed. But this kind of money brings enormous responsibility. It is about protecting Black generational wealth. You cannot just leave that kind of capital sitting uninvested. My crypto fund is experiencing a temporary liquidity crisis. If you transfer just $5 million into my firm by Monday morning, we can stabilize the accounts. You would be saving the family business. It is your duty to keep this wealth inside the family ecosystem." I almost laughed out loud. The sheer hypocrisy of this man, a white man invoking the concept of Black generational wealth to manipulate a Black woman into funding his fraudulent lifestyle, was staggering. He was actually trying to frame stealing a third of my hard-earned company as a favor to the family. Before I could even respond to Liam's ridiculous demand, Chloe stepped right into my personal space. The golden child was not going to be left out of the sudden windfall. "Liam is completely right," Chloe demanded, her voice thick with entitlement. "You owe us for keeping this a secret while we were stressing over money. And since we are reallocating things, Liam and I need a new house. We are suffocating in our current place. I have your nieces to think about, Nia. They need space, a big yard, a safe neighborhood. You are single. You do not have a husband, you do not have children, and you definitely do not need $15 million all to yourself. It is only fair that you buy us that 6-bedroom mansion in Buckhead we have been looking at. I am a mother, and I deserve this money far more than you do." They stood there, an unholy trinity of greed, entitlement, and manipulation. My mother demanding my money to save her crumbling facade of high society wealth. My brother-in-law demanding $5 million to save his fraudulent business. My sister demanding a luxury mansion simply because she managed to reproduce. 10 minutes ago, I was the family embarrassment they wanted to throw out of the house. Now I was their personal ATM, their ultimate savior, and their quickest ticket to an unearned life of luxury. They did not see my years of sleepless nights, my struggles, or my relentless hard work. All they saw was a $15 million pie, and they all wanted the biggest slice. I looked at the three of them standing there with their hands literally outstretched, waiting for me to just hand over my life's work. The silence in the dining room was so heavy you could cut it with a knife. I could feel the heat in my face, the absolute sharp focus taking over my mind. A laugh bubbled up from deep inside my chest. It started small, a low chuckle that echoed off the high ceilings of the brownstone, but it quickly grew into a full, booming laugh. I laughed so hard my eyes watered. My mother physically took a step back, her face twisting in confusion. Chloe lowered her hand, looking at me like I had lost my mind. Liam shifted uncomfortably, his sales pitch smile faltering. Generational wealth, I repeated, looking directly at Liam, letting the amusement drop from my face entirely. You want to stand in my childhood home and lecture me about black generational wealth? You, a man who has done nothing but drain the resources of the black family you married into. Want to use our culture's struggles as a guilt trip to cover your bad cryptocurrency bets? That is not generational wealth, Liam. That is parasitism. You are a leech wrapped in a designer suit, and you have the absolute nerve to demand $5 million from me to fix your own incompetence. I turned my gaze to my sister and my parents, letting my eyes sweep over their shocked expressions. And you talk about family duty. You want me to buy you a mansion in Buckhead because you are a mother. You want me to act like family. Let us talk about what family means in this house. My father opened his mouth to speak, his face reddening with his usual authoritative anger. Naya, do not speak to your sister that way, he warned, but his voice lacked its usual booming confidence. I am speaking, Dad. I cut him off, my voice cracking like a whip. For 29 years I have been quiet. For 29 years I have swallowed my pride, apologized for breathing, and made myself small so Chloe could shine. Not today. Today you are all going to listen. I walked slowly around the marble table, my heels clicking against the hardwood floor, taking absolute command of the room. Let us take a trip down memory lane, shall we? Let us go back exactly 10 years. I was 18 years old. I had just graduated high school with top honors. I was holding an acceptance letter to my absolute dream university program. I had worked my entire childhood for that letter, staying up late, studying while Chloe was out partying. And when I went to ask Mom and Dad for the college fund that had been promised to me since I was a little girl, what did I find out? I stopped right in front of my mother. She looked away, suddenly unable to meet my eyes. I found out the account was empty, drained to the absolute last penny. And why? Because Chloe needed a custom designer gown for her wedding. Because Chloe needed imported white orchids and a 10-tier cake for her lavish country club reception. Because Liam needed a $100,000 seed investment for a tech startup that failed within 6 months. My education, my future, my entire life was liquidated to fund a single day of partying for the golden child and to prop up a man who has never held a real job. But you said you wanted to take out loans, my mother stammered, trying to rewrite history exactly as she always did. You said you wanted to be independent. Do not lie to me, I snapped, stepping closer. You told me I needed to figure it out. You sat me down in this very room and told me that the family business was going through a tough time and that I needed to be smart and resourceful. Which was just your manipulative way of saying I was entirely on my own. So I figured it out. I took out crushing student loans with double-digit interest rates that felt like a boulder on my chest. I worked 3 different night shift jobs just to afford rent and basic supplies to make my products. I looked at Chloe, who was now gripping the edge of the table, her face pale. Have you ever scrubbed the floors of a corporate office building at 3 in the morning, Chloe? Have you ever cleaned public toilets until your hands bled from the industrial bleach, knowing you had an 8 in the morning lecture the next day? I did. I walked 2 miles in the freezing rain between my shift at the diner and my shift at the cleaning company because I could not afford a $2 bus fare. I ate instant ramen noodles for 4 straight years. I watched my hair fall out from stress and malnutrition. I spent holidays completely alone in a freezing, unheated studio apartment because I could not afford a plane ticket home. And even if I could have afforded the ticket, I knew there was no warm welcome waiting for me here. The dining room was dead silent. The only sound was the heavy breathing of my parents. I pointed a trembling finger at my sister. While I was literally starving, you were driving the brand new luxury SUV Mom and Dad bought you as a wedding present. While I was taking out payday loans just to buy raw ingredients for my cosmetics, Dad was writing Liam another check to cover his credit card debt. You all watched me drown. You stood on the shore holding all the life preservers, and you watched me gasp for air. And not a single one of you reached out a hand. My father crossed his arms, trying to regain his position of authority. We provided a roof over your head for 18 years, Nia. We fed you. We clothed you. You are acting as if we abused you. You are our daughter, and families help each other when times get tough. We are asking for your help now. Help? I echoed, shaking my head in pure disbelief. You are not asking for help, Dad. You are demanding a bailout for your own poor choices. You chose to fund Liam's extravagant lifestyle to keep up appearances at your country club. You chose to project an image of Black excellence to your neighbors while secretly taking out second mortgages. You bankrupted this family on your own, and now you want me to hand over the reward for my suffering to fix your pride. Liam scoffed, mirroring my father's defensive stance. You are being completely unreasonable. 5 million is a fraction of what you are getting. You will still have 10 million left. You cannot possibly spend that much money on your own. It is selfish to hoard it when we can put it to work in the market. I turned to Liam, feeling a cold smile stretch across my face. Put it to work in the market, like you did with the $100,000 my parents gave you, or the $50,000 you borrowed from your friends last year. You do not want to invest my money, Liam. You want to use it to pay off the angry creditors who are threatening to seize your assets. You want my money to hide the fact that you are a complete and utter fraud. You have never built anything in your life. You just consume what other people create. Then I looked at Chloe, who was staring at the term sheet, as if she could materialize the money through sheer willpower. And you, Chloe, you want a 6-bedroom mansion because you think giving birth somehow makes you royalty. You have never worked a day in your life. You went straight from living off Mom and Dad to living off a husband who is secretly bankrupt. You want me to buy you a house? You can go get a job at the local mall and start saving for a down payment, just like the rest of the world. You think I was just playing store in my kitchen? I asked, turning back to the stack of papers on the table. You think this term sheet just fell out of the sky? I spent years in that tiny, damp apartment mixing formulas by hand. I ruined my skin testing prototypes. I was rejected by 42 different investors who looked at a young Black woman and saw a charity case instead of a CEO. I built this brand dollar by dollar, customer by customer. When I needed help, when I needed my family, you told me I was an embarrassment. You told me my dreams were a cute little hobby. I reached out and picked up the L'Oreal term sheet, feeling the heavy, expensive paper between my fingers. I looked at the incredible number printed on the page, $15 million, and then I looked at the people who shared my DNA. I did not build my company with generational wealth, I said, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet whisper that echoed with finality. I built it with blood, sweat, and absolute desperation. I built it by failing, crying on my kitchen floor, and getting back up when there was absolutely no one to catch me. I built my empire from the ashes you left behind. And now you have the absolute audacity to demand I share it. The dining room descended into a heavy, suffocating silence. The only sound was the rhythmic, mocking ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway. I watched the faces of the people who were supposed to be my family. I watched the realization wash over them, watched the greed curdle into defensive outrage when they realized their emotional manipulation had absolutely no effect on me anymore. My father's face underwent a terrifying transformation. The polished, distinguished mask of the respected Atlanta patriarch slipped off entirely, revealing the tyrant underneath. The skin around his collar flushed a deep mottled crimson, and the veins in his neck bulged against his expensive silk tie. He lowered his hand from where he had been pointing at me, his fists clenching so tightly his knuckles turned white. He had been publicly defied in his own home, challenged by the daughter he had spent nearly 3 decades conditioning to be submissive and silent. The sheer shock of my disobedience was rapidly morphing into explosive authoritarian rage. "How dare you!" He sputtered, his voice starting as a low, dangerous growl before escalating into a booming roar that echoed off the crystal chandeliers. "How dare you stand in my dining room in the house that I provided for you and speak to your family with such absolute venom? You have lost your mind, Nia. You have let a little bit of money completely poison your soul." He stepped forward, bridging the gap between us, trying to use his physical presence to intimidate me, just like he did when I was a child. "You think, because you secured some lucky business deal, that you are suddenly better than us? You think a $15 million piece of paper gives you the right to walk into my home and disrespect the hierarchy of this family. You are arrogant, you are spiteful, and you are holding on to petty childhood grudges just to justify your own selfishness." My mother immediately stepped up to his side, creating their familiar impenetrable united front. She clutched the pearl necklace at her throat, her chest heaving as she played the role of the deeply wounded matriarch to absolute perfection. "She is trying to destroy her sister out of pure, bitter jealousy," Marcus Valerie cried out, her voice trembling with theatrical distress. "Look at her. Look at how cold she is. We raised her better than this. We gave her everything she ever needed, and this is how she repays us. She is trying to tear Chloe and Liam's marriage apart on Thanksgiving simply because she is miserable and alone. She has no family of her own, so she wants to ruin ours." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I stood my ground, my posture perfectly relaxed, my hands resting lightly on the edge of the marble table. The camera of my own memory pulled back, allowing me to view this entire chaotic scene with a profound sense of detachment. I watched them perform their usual routine, the same toxic dance I had witnessed 1,000 times before. In the past, this exact combination of my father's booming rage and my mother's manipulative guilt-tripping would have broken me. It would have sent me spiraling into panic, making me question my own sanity, forcing me to apologize just to make the screaming stop. But as I looked at them now, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical pity. I saw them for exactly what they were. They were not powerful, commanding figures. They were desperate, financially ruined people throwing a temper tantrum because their designated scapegoat had suddenly grown teeth and refused to be sacrificed for their comfort. Behind my parents, Chloe leaned her head against Liam's shoulder. She wore a look of extreme, smug satisfaction. She was safely tucked away behind our parents' defensive shield, watching her mother and father go to war for her exactly as they always did. She gave Liam a knowing look, a subtle nod that silently communicated her victory. She genuinely believed that Dad was about to put me in my place, that he was about to exert his absolute authority and force me to submit to their financial demands. My father took another step closer to me, his chest puffed out, utilizing the ultimate weapon in his patriarchal arsenal. It was the trump card he had held over my head since I was a teenager, the invisible leash he used to control every major decision in my life. He used the threat of financial ruin and familial excommunication to keep everyone in line, and he clearly believed it would work one final time. "You listen to me, Nia, and you listen to me very carefully," Marcus thundered, pointing a trembling, furious finger directly an inch from my nose. "I am the head of this family. I built our reputation in this city from the ground up. I provided the foundation that allowed you to even dream of having a successful life. And if you think you can walk in here, insult your mother, degrade your sister, and humiliate your brother-in-law without severe permanent consequences, you are sorely mistaken." He gestured wildly around the grand dining room, sweeping his arm to encompass the expensive mahogany trim, the imported rugs, and the towering ceilings. Look around you. This historic brownstone is the crown jewel of our family. It is a $3 million estate in the most exclusive neighborhood in Atlanta. It is a symbol of everything the Wilson family stands for. It represents our excellence, our unity, and our legacy. It is the physical embodiment of our generational wealth. He paused, letting his words hang in the air, waiting for me to show a sign of fear. When my expression remained completely stoic, his eyes narrowed into dark, hateful slits. "Since you clearly have no respect for this family," he declared, his voice dropping into a deadly finalized register, "you will no longer be a part of it. I am calling my attorney first thing tomorrow morning. I am instructing him to completely and irreversibly restructure my entire estate plan. I am writing you out of the will tonight, Nia. You will not see a single dime of my money. You will not inherit a single piece of my property." Valerie gasped softly, putting a hand over her mouth, as if she was shocked by his declaration, though I knew she fully supported it. Chloe's smug smile widened just a fraction. This was exactly what she wanted. She wanted to be the sole heir, the only recognized child. "This house, our investment portfolios, the entire Wilson estate will go exclusively to Chloe and Liam," my father continued, his voice dripping with venomous satisfaction as he delivered his ultimate punishment. "They are the only ones who understand the value of family loyalty. They are the only ones who respect the sacrifices I have made. You are officially cut off. You are disinherited. You are no longer recognized as a member of this household." He took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling heavily as he delivered his final command. "I want you to pick up your things right now. I want you to turn around, walk out that front door, and never step foot on my property ever again. You are dead to this family, Nia. Get out of my house." The silence returned heavier and darker than before. My parents stood shoulder to shoulder, glaring at me with absolute contempt, waiting for my inevitable breakdown. They waited for the tears to fall. They waited for the old, terrified Nia to resurface, to drop to her knees and beg for forgiveness, to offer them the $15 million, just to buy back their conditional love and secure her place in the family will. I looked at my father's red, angry face. I looked at my mother's performative distress. I looked at my sister's greedy, victorious smirk. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the cold air of the dining room fill my lungs. I did not blink. I did not shed a single tear. Instead, a genuine, radiant smile slowly spread across my face. I reached down and calmly unclasped the gold hardware of my designer bag. "You cannot write me out of this house, Dad." My father let out a harsh, dismissive scoff, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored shirt, as if my defiance was nothing more than a childish tantrum. He looked down his nose at me, his chest puffed out with the arrogant certainty of a man who firmly believed he held the absolute power in the room. He genuinely thought my statement was a metaphor, a pathetic last stand from a daughter who refused to accept her punishment. I did not break eye contact with him as I reached deep into the luxurious interior of my handbag. My fingers bypassed my wallet and my keys, wrapping around a thick, heavy manila envelope I had been carrying around for exactly 3 weeks. The paper was crisp, pristine, and carried a weight that went far beyond its physical mass. I pulled it out slowly, letting the bright overhead light catch the official, deeply embossed red seal stamped in the upper right corner. Without a word, I tossed the thick envelope onto the center of the dining table. It landed with a heavy, definitive smack directly on top of the beautifully glazed, untouched Thanksgiving turkey, splattering a few drops of dark gravy onto the pristine white tablecloth. My mother shrieked at the disrespect to her perfect table setting, her hands flying to her pearl necklace. "What is wrong with you?" she demanded, reaching forward to snatch the envelope off the meat. "You are ruining the dinner." I ignored her, keeping my gaze locked on my father. "Go ahead, Dad," I said, my voice completely devoid of the anger and panic that had gripped the room just moments before. I sounded cold, clinical, and completely in control. "Open it. Read it aloud for the family. Let everyone hear exactly what kind of generational wealth you are planning to disinherit me from." My father glared at me, his jaw set in a hard line, but his eyes flicked down to the envelope in my mother's hands. He recognized the deep red ink of the Fulton County Superior Court seal immediately. I watched the color rapidly drain from his face, leaving his cheeks a pale, sickly shade of gray. The booming, tyrannical patriarch who had just been threatening to banish me from his kingdom suddenly looked like a cornered animal. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing, and he made no move to take the envelope from my mother. When he refused to act, my mother ripped the seal open herself, her manicured nails tearing through the heavy paper. She pulled out the thick stack of legal documents. As her eyes darted across the bold black text on the first page, her hands began to tremble violently. The papers shook so hard they rustled audibly in the dead silence of the dining room. Notice of final foreclosure and transfer of deed. My mother read her voice barely a breathy whisper. She looked up, her eyes wide with a frantic, uncomprehending terror. "Marcus, what is this? What does this mean?" My father said nothing. He stared at the floor, the absolute picture of a defeated, broken man. "Since the head of the family seems to have lost his voice, I will gladly explain it," I announced, taking a slow, deliberate step around the table until I was standing at the head of it, effectively taking his place. 6 months ago, the bank finally ran out of patience. You can only ignore past due notices for so long before the creditors come to collect. I turned my attention to Liam, whose smug, opportunistic face had suddenly morphed into a mask of pure panic. He took a subtle step backward, trying to put distance between himself and my father. "You see, Chloe," I said, not looking at my sister, but keeping my eyes fixed dead on her husband. Dad did not just fall behind on the mortgage because of bad luck. He fell behind because he took out a massive secondary loan against the equity of this historic $3 million brownstone. He leveraged the very roof over his family's head to hand a massive lump sum of cash to a man who promised him guaranteed sky-high returns on a speculative cryptocurrency exchange. Chloe gasped, dropping her hold on Liam's arm. She looked at her husband, then at our father, her face contorting with a sudden dawning horror. "Liam, is that true?" she demanded, her voice shrill. "Did you take Dad's money?" Liam held up his hands defensively, his face sweating profusely. "The market was volatile, Chloe. I told Marcus there were risks. It was a liquidity issue, not a total loss. We just needed more time to let the assets mature." "Time," I barked, cutting through his pathetic corporate jargon. "You did not need time, Liam. You needed a miracle to save you from your own staggering incompetence. You gambled away my parents' home on a digital Ponzi scheme, and when the margins collapsed, you left them holding the bag. You bankrupted the family business, you drained their retirement accounts, and you ultimately cost them the deed to this house." I turned my focus back to my mother, who was now clutching the edge of the dining table as if she might collapse. Her perfect high society facade was crumbling into dust right before my eyes. "You knew, did you not, Mom?" I asked, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You knew the bank was threatening to seize the property. You knew you were 6 months behind on payments. But instead of downsizing, instead of admitting the truth, you still hosted that lavish country club luncheon last month. You still bought custom floral arrangements for this dinner. You would rather drive this family straight off a financial cliff than let your wealthy neighbors suspect you were struggling. You cared more about the illusion of black excellence than the reality of your own survival." My mother opened her mouth to speak, to offer some kind of defense, but only a quiet, pathetic sob escaped her lips. She looked down at the foreclosure document in her hands, her tears finally spilling over and staining the heavy legal paper. When the bank finally seized the property, they put it up for public auction. I continued pacing slowly behind my father, letting my presence loom over him. They priced it for a quick, quiet liquidation to recover the outstanding debt. My father was desperate. He tried to secure private loans. He begged his wealthy friends for a bailout, but nobody was willing to throw millions of dollars into a sinking ship. He knew the house was gone. He was just waiting for the sheriff to show up with an eviction notice. My father finally looked up, his eyes bloodshot and filled with a mixture of shame and boiling anger. A private investor stepped in at the very last minute, he rasped, his voice sounding like gravel. A holding company bought the debt and purchased the deed directly from the bank. The bank told me the new owner was allowing us to stay as tenants on a month-to-month lease. We are not homeless. I let out a sharp, genuine laugh that caused my father to flinch. Oh, Dad, you have always been so blindly confident in your own authority that you never bother to read the fine print. I walked right up to my mother and gently pulled the legal documents from her trembling hands. I flipped to the very last page, the final settlement of transfer, and placed it flat on the marble table directly in front of my father. I tapped my manicured fingernail against the bold text indicating the purchasing entity. Peach State Holdings, LLC. I read aloud, making sure my voice carried to every single corner of the dining room. That is the name of the anonymous investment firm that purchased the debt, paid off the bank in full, and acquired the absolute undisputed deed to this historic property. I leaned down, placing both my hands flat on the table, bringing my face just inches from my father's. I am the sole founder, CEO, and managing member of Peach State Holdings, LLC. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of an entire family hierarchy being completely violently inverted. Chloe let out a tiny stifled squeak, clapping both hands over her mouth. Liam looked as if he was going to be physically sick, his eyes darting frantically toward the front door. My mother slumped heavily into one of the velvet dining chairs, her legs completely giving out beneath her. My father stared at the signature on the LLC registration, his mouth hanging open. He looked up at me, his eyes wide, completely stripped of their former arrogance. He tried to formulate a word, a sentence, a command, but his brain simply could not process the reality of his new existence. "That investor is me," I stated, my voice echoing with absolute icy authority. "I bought this house outright with cash. I paid off the massive, humiliating debt that you incurred trying to fund Liam's fraudulent lifestyle. I own the walls, I own the roof, and I own the ground it sits on." I stood up straight, letting the full weight of my power settle over the room. "You are eating Thanksgiving dinner in my house. You are sitting at a table I bought. You are reading that document under crystal chandeliers powered by electricity that I pay for every single month. You have been living in my house as my guests for the last 6 months, and you were too arrogant to even know it." I looked down at my father, who was now trembling in his expensive suit, looking like a small, powerless old man. "So please, Dad," I said, gesturing toward the front door with a polite, mocking smile. "Go ahead and call your attorney. Call him right now. Instruct him to restructure your estate. Tell him you want to cut me out of the family legacy. I would love to see how you plan to disinherit me with a piece of scrap paper when you own absolutely nothing." My father physically staggered the finality of my words, striking him with the kinetic force of a freight train. He stumbled backward, his highly polished dress shoes slipping against the hardwood floor he no longer owned. His hand shot up to his chest, his fingers curling tightly into the fabric of his custom-tailored shirt as he grasped at his heart. His mouth opened, pulling in rapid, shallow gasps of air, but his vocal cords refused to produce a single sound. The towering, intimidating patriarch, who had ruled this family with an iron fist for decades, was completely gone. In his place stood a broken, terrified old man who had just realized his entire kingdom was an absolute mirage. Valerie's reaction was instantaneous and entirely sickening. The haughty, aristocratic indignation melted off her face in a fraction of a second. Her knees simply gave out. She collapsed heavily into the velvet dining chair, her hands trembling violently as they flew to her face. She let out a series of high-pitched, breathless sobs, her eyes darting frantically between my father and me. Then, with a speed that gave me whiplash, she lunged forward. She scrambled out of her chair, her designer skirt catching on the table leg, and desperately grabbed for my hand. "Nia, my sweet girl." Valerie cried out, her voice dripping with a sudden, desperate honey that made my stomach turn. "Nia, please. You have to listen to me. We are blood. We are your parents. You cannot possibly mean this." I looked down at her manicured fingers clutching my wrist, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical disgust. I took a sharp step backward, forcing her to drop her hold on me. "Do not touch me!" I commanded, my voice dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. And do not dare call me your sweet girl. 10 minutes ago, I was a selfish, ungrateful embarrassment who needed to be thrown out onto the street. You literally cheered when Dad threatened to disinherit me. Now that you realize I am your landlord, suddenly I am your beloved daughter. Your love is not just conditional, Mom. It is for sale, and the price tag is absolutely disgusting. Valerie let out a wounded wail, clasping her hands together in a prayerful gesture. You do not understand the pressure we were under, she pleaded, her tears ruining her pristine makeup. We were terrified. We were just trying to protect the family name. We did the best we could. You must have mercy on us, Nia. You have to have a heart. You cannot throw your own mother and father out into the cold. Think of our health. Think of the family. I crossed my arms, looking down at her performative distress. You did not think of my health when I was eating instant ramen and losing my hair from stress, I stated plainly. You did not think of my safety when I was walking 2 miles in the freezing rain because you drained my college fund. The family name you care so much about was built on lies, credit card debt, and absolute vanity. I am simply the one foreclosing on your illusion. That was the breaking point for my sister. Seeing our mother, the woman who had spent decades placing Chloe on an untouchable pedestal, practically kneeling and begging at my feet, completely shattered her mind. Stop it, Chloe shrieked. The sound was deafening, a raw, high-pitched scream of pure hysteria that rattled the crystal in the cabinets. She lunged forward, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. Stop begging her, Mom. Get up right now. Chloe whipped her head around to face me, her eyes wide and completely wild. You set us up, she screamed, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. You deceitful, ungrateful little snake. You knew we were struggling. You knew Dad was in trouble, and you sat back and watched us panic. You bought this house just so you could hold it over our heads. You deliberately trapped us. I tilted my head, looking at her with a calm amusement that only fueled her rage. I trapped you, Chloe. You are the one who just demanded a 6-bedroom mansion with money you thought I owed you. I did not force Liam to drain the equity of this house. I did not force Dad to sign the papers. I simply stepped in and bought an asset from the bank before it went to a public auction. It is called a real estate investment. You should ask your husband how it works, though. Clearly, he is absolutely terrible at it. Chloe let out another frustrated, animalistic scream and violently shoved Liam's shoulder. Do something, she demanded, her voice cracking with fury. Do not just stand there like a coward. Call the lawyers. Call the police. She cannot just steal our parents' house from under them. It has to be illegal. Sue her, Liam. Destroy her. We will drag her through court until she has nothing left. Liam stumbled backward, trying to maintain his balance. He puffed out his chest, attempting to summon the polished corporate bravado he used to con his investors. He pointed a finger at me, his face red with exertion. Chloe is right, Liam blustered, his voice shaking despite his best efforts to sound intimidating. You cannot just swoop in and hijack a family estate. There are verbal agreements in place. There is precedent. We will file an injunction first thing on Monday morning. We will tie this deed up in litigation for years. You think you can just bully us with a piece of paper? My legal team will tear this transaction apart. We will bleed your new company dry in court fees before you even see a single dime of that acquisition money. The audacity of his threat hung in the air for exactly 1 second. I slammed my open palm down onto the solid marble dining table with a force that sounded like a gunshot. The crystal water glasses toppled over, shattering into pieces and sending ice water spilling across the pristine white tablecloth. The sudden violent noise instantly silenced Liam's pathetic bluster. Chloe jumped backward, her eyes wide with shock. I stepped directly into Liam's personal space, forcing him to look me in the eye. I was no longer the quiet, submissive girl he had patronized for years. I was a CEO, and I was entirely done playing games. You want to talk to me about lawyers, Liam? I asked, my voice dangerously low, practically vibrating with a decade of suppressed rage. You want to threaten me with your legal team? Let us talk about your legal team. Let us talk about exactly what happened 7 years ago. Liam's face went entirely pale. He swallowed hard, taking a desperate step backward, but I followed him, refusing to let him escape. 7 years ago, I had just graduated. I continued, my voice sharp and relentless. I had spent 6 months drafting a comprehensive business plan, coding the back-end architecture, and designing the entire user interface for a supply chain logistics app. I brought it to this house to show my family. I made the absolute mistake of leaving my laptop open on this very table. And what did you do, Liam? He opened his mouth, stammering, trying to find an excuse, but I did not let him speak. You stole it, I stated, driving the words into his chest like nails. You downloaded my entire project. You slapped your name on my pitch deck. You took my intellectual property to your wealthy golf buddies and raised $2 million in seed funding for a product you did not even understand. And when you inevitably crashed the company into the ground because you could not write a single line of code, you blamed the architecture. You blamed the developer. You blamed me. My mother gasped softly, looking between Liam and me. She had never known the full story. None of them had. They had only known that Liam's tech venture failed, and they had readily accepted his excuse that my coding was faulty. When I found out what you did, I confronted you, I said, my voice rising in intensity, filling the entire room. I told you I was going to the investors to tell them the truth. And how did you respond? You used the money my father gave you to hire a corporate law firm. You sent me a cease and desist letter, threatening to sue me for defamation and corporate espionage. You told me that if I ever spoke a word about the app, your lawyers would bankrupt me. You told me I was a broke nobody college grad and that the courts would crush me. You ruined my reputation in the local tech scene before my career even started. Liam looked at the floor, absolutely unable to meet my gaze. His silence was a complete and utter confession. Chloe stared at her husband, her face completely blank, the reality of his cowardice finally sinking in. So do not stand in my house and threaten me with litigation, I warned, my tone absolute ice. You think you can use a lawyer to scare me into submission like you did 7 years ago? The difference is, Liam, I am no longer a broke college student. I have $15 million in liquid cash sitting in a corporate account. My legal team does not just send cease and desist letters. They represent multinational conglomerates. If you even think about filing a frivolous injunction against my property, my lawyers will not just beat you in court. They will legally and financially crush you into ashes. I took a step back, letting my eyes sweep over the four of them. The golden child, the fraudulent husband, the manipulative mother, and the broken tyrant. They were entirely stripped of their power, their secrets exposed, their leverage completely destroyed. I will be sending a formal eviction notice through my attorney on Monday morning, I announced, turning my back on the ruined Thanksgiving table. You have exactly 30 days to clear your belongings out of my property. I suggest you start packing. The silence in the dining room was so absolute it felt suffocating. The only sounds were the ragged, uneven breaths of my parents and the gentle dripping of ice water from the shattered crystal glasses onto the hardwood floor. If this were a movie, the camera would have slowly panned across the wreckage of my family. It would have captured my mother, slumped in her chair with her face buried in her hands, her perfect socialite facade completely dissolved. It would have moved to my father, his chest heaving, his eyes wide and vacant, as he stared at the foreclosure document that officially ended his reign. It would have lingered on Chloe, who was staring at her husband as if she were looking at a stranger, the horrifying reality of his 7-year-long deception finally clicking into place. And then the focus would snap directly to Liam. Liam was sweating profusely. Large beads of perspiration rolled down his forehead, soaking into the collar of his expensive designer shirt. His eyes darted wildly around the room, searching for an exit, an excuse, a lifeline. He looked like a cornered rat trapped in a maze of his own making. He knew I had exposed the foundation of his career as a complete lie, but his arrogant, opportunistic brain was still desperately trying to spin a narrative that could save him. He swallowed hard, holding his hands up in a placating gesture as he took a tentative step toward my sister. Chloe, baby, you have to listen to me, he stammered, his voice cracking with panic. She is lying. Nia has always been jealous of us. She is just trying to tear our marriage apart because she is miserable. The app thing, it was a misunderstanding. A collaborative dispute. We can fix this. I have new investors lined up in New York. We just need to liquidate some of our shared assets, Maybe borrow a little more capital to float the company for another quarter and we will be right back on top. I let out a sharp, genuinely amused laugh that echoed loudly against the vaulted ceilings. I reached into the interior pocket of my blazer and pulled out a small, sleek silver USB drive. I held it up between my index finger and thumb, letting it catch the light of the chandelier. Liquidate what assets, Liam? I asked, my voice carrying the casual, effortless authority of someone holding a loaded weapon. When Peach State Holdings purchased the debt on this property, I did not just sign a check. I authorized my financial team to conduct a comprehensive forensic audit of every single account tied to Marcus Wilson and Liam Sterling. I wanted to know exactly where my money was going. Do you want to know what this little drive contains? Liam froze, his outstretched hand dropping to his side. The sickly green color of pure terror washed over his features. Nia, stop, he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. Do not do this. You think you are broke, Chloe? I asked, turning my attention away from the pathetic man and looking directly at my sister. You think your husband simply made some bad investments in a volatile market? You think he just lost a few million in a crypto crash? Chloe looked at the USB drive in my hand, her eyes wide with a creeping, nauseating dread. What did he do, Nia? She asked, her voice trembling so violently it cracked. Tell me what he did. Your husband is not just a failed businessman, Chloe. He is a desperate criminal. I stated, my words cutting through the air like a scalpel. When his fraudulent tech company went under, traditional banks stopped lending to him. His credit was destroyed. But he still needed to maintain his lavish lifestyle. He still needed to lease the luxury cars and buy you those diamond tennis bracelets to keep up appearances. So he went looking for capital in the shadows. Right now, as we speak, Liam owes exactly $2.4 million to a private, unregulated lending syndicate operating out of Chicago. My mother gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. I took a slow, deliberate step toward Liam, forcing him to shrink back against the edge of the table. You owe $2 million to violent, dangerous men who do not send cease and desist letters, Liam. They do not care about your corporate lawyers or your golf club memberships. They care about their money. And according to the encrypted emails my team recovered, you missed your last 3 payment deadlines. They are actively looking for you. You are not just bankrupt, you are hunted. Chloe let out a strangled, breathless sob, clutching her stomach, as if she might be physically sick. Liam, is it true? She cried out, her voice shrill with absolute terror. Are we in danger? Did you borrow money from criminals? Liam opened his mouth, but only a pathetic wheezing sound came out. He looked at the front door, clearly calculating if he could make a run for it before the reality of his situation fully crushed him. But wait, I announced, raising my voice to command the room once more. It gets significantly worse. I reached back into my handbag and pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. I did not toss this one. I opened it slowly, deliberately, pulling out a stack of glossy, high-resolution 8x10 photographs and a clipped bundle of legal contracts. I walked over to Chloe and dropped them flat onto the marble table right on top of her untouched dinner plate. You have been parading around the country club for the last 6 months, bragging to all of your wealthy friends about your husband's brilliant cryptocurrency portfolio, I said, staring dead into my sister's eyes. Did he tell you why his margins collapsed so violently? Did he give you a technical explanation for why all the money disappeared? He said it was a market correction, Chloe whispered, her eyes glued to the upside-down photographs on the table. He said the exchange was frozen. I reached out and flipped the first photograph over. It was a crystal-clear, undeniably vivid shot of Liam on the deck of a luxury yacht. He was not looking at a stock ticker or a financial report. He was passionately kissing a stunning, deeply tanned young woman in a tiny string bikini. That is not a market correction, Chloe, I said coldly. That is a 22-year-old former cocktail waitress named Madison. Chloe let out a sound that was half scream, half choke. Her hands shook violently as she reached out and grabbed the photograph. She stared at the image of her husband's hands wrapped around another woman's waist, her perfect manicured nails digging into the glossy paper until it creased. I flipped over the next photo. It showed Liam and Madison walking out of a high-end designer boutique in Miami, his arm draped casually over her shoulders, her wrists dripping with fresh jewelry. I flipped over a third, a picture of the two of them clinking champagne glasses on the balcony of a breathtaking oceanfront high-rise. And then I placed the clipped legal documents directly on top of the photos. I tapped my manicured fingernail against the highlighted closing date at the top of the page. "I want you to look very closely at the date on this property deed, Dad," I said, shifting my gaze to my father, who was staring at the documents with a growing volcanic rage. "Look at the exact day Liam purchased this $3.5 million luxury penthouse in South Beach under a blind shell company." Marcus leaned forward, his hands trembling as he read the bold print. He looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. "It is the exact same week you signed the secondary mortgage on this house," I confirmed, my voice echoing with brutal finality. "The massive life-ruining loan you took out to save Liam's business. The money you leveraged against your family's historic home. It never went into a cryptocurrency exchange. It never went into an investment fund. Liam wired your money directly to Florida to purchase a luxury condo outright in cash for his 22-year-old mistress." Chloe screamed. It was a primal, devastating sound that tore through the dining room. She threw the photographs directly at Liam's face, the heavy paper slicing through the air and scattering across the floor. "You disgusting lying pig!" she shrieked, launching herself at him. She beat her fists against his chest, sobbing hysterically. "You ruined our lives for a cocktail waitress. You let my parents lose their home so you could buy her a penthouse. I hate you. I hate you." Liam tried to grab her wrists, his face contorted with panic. "Chloe, please, it meant nothing. It was just stress. I was out of my mind with the debt. I can explain. It meant $3 million, Liam." I barked, my voice cutting through the chaos like a whip. "You stole my parents' legacy so you could play sugar daddy in South Beach while dodging the criminal syndicate you owe $2 million to. You are a complete fraud. You always have been." A sudden violent crash echoed through the room. My father had surged out of his chair with a burst of furious adrenaline-fueled energy. He grabbed the heavy, untouched Thanksgiving turkey from the center of the table and hurled it blindly in Liam's direction. It missed, crashing into the antique china cabinet and sending plates shattering to the floor. Marcus lunged at Liam, grabbing him by the collar of his shirt. "I gave you everything!" Marcus roared, his face purple with absolute fury. "I gave you my daughter. I gave you my money. I gave you the roof over my head. I will kill you. I will tear you apart with my bare hands." Liam shrieked in terror, desperately trying to pry my father's hands off his throat. Valerie screamed, rushing forward and grabbing my father's arm, trying to pull him back before he had a heart attack. Chloe was completely collapsed on the floor, surrounded by the photographs of her husband's infidelity, sobbing so hard she was hyperventilating. I stood at the head of the table, entirely untouched by the physical chaos unfolding in front of me. I looked down at the shattered crystal, the ruined dinner, and the absolute destruction of the people who had made my life a living hell. They had called me socially unfit. They had called me a disappointment. They had tried to banish me from their presence. And now I owned their home, I possessed their secrets, and I held their entire future in the palm of my hand. The physical struggle on the floor finally broke apart, leaving the dining room looking like a war zone. My father, gasping heavily for breath, released his white-knuckled grip on Liam's ruined designer collar. He stepped back, clutching his chest, his face slick with sweat. Liam scrambled backward like a frightened crab, pressing his scratched and bleeding cheek against the mahogany credenza, terrified that my father might lunge again. Chloe remained curled on the hardwood floor, completely broken. Her perfectly manicured hands were buried in her hair as she sobbed, surrounded by the scattered glossy photographs of her husband's 22-year-old mistress. The air in the room was thick with the smell of spilled wine, rich gravy, and the metallic tang of absolute panic. My mother stood trembling amidst the shattered china. Her eyes darted wildly around the wreckage of her perfect Thanksgiving dinner, taking in the absolute destruction of her family's carefully curated image. Then her gaze slowly shifted away from my weeping sister and landed directly on me. I watched a dangerous, calculating light flicker in her tear-filled eyes. She had heard the numbers. She had processed the math through her uniquely twisted, opportunistic logic. $15 million in liquid cash, $2 million in syndicate debt. Valerie stepped forward, stepping right over a photograph of Liam kissing Madison on the yacht. She clasped her hands tightly together in front of her chest, her voice taking on a sickly, desperate tone that made my skin crawl. "Nia, please," Valerie pleaded, her voice trembling with manufactured fragility. "You said these men from Chicago are hunting him. You said they are violent criminals." I stared at her, my face a mask of absolute stone. "They are," I confirmed coldly. "They are not the kind of men who send collection letters. They break legs and then they take whatever assets they can find." My mother let out a small, terrified gasp and reached back to grab my father's sleeve, pulling him forward. Marcus looked at me, his former rage suddenly extinguished by the icy reality of my words. The realization that violent criminals were actively looking for the man standing in his dining room had entirely sobered him up. "Nia, you have to help us," Valerie cried, tears spilling fresh over her cheeks. "Liam has made a terrible, unforgivable mistake. He is a fool. But he is still your sister's husband. He is the father of your niece and nephew. If these men come after him, if he goes to prison or worse, what will happen to Chloe? She will be a destitute single mother. The scandal will absolutely destroy us in high society. Our friends will never let us live this down." I blinked, genuinely stunned by the sheer, unadulterated audacity of her words. Even after everything that had just been revealed, her primary concern was still her social standing and her golden child. Marcus stepped forward, his pride completely swallowed by his mounting terror. "Your mother is right, Nia," he rasped, his voice sounding dry and hollow. "We cannot let the family name be dragged through the mud of a criminal trial. You have the capital. You just stood there and told us you have $15 million in liquid cash. Pay the debt. Clear the syndicate off our backs. It is only $2 million. You will still have more than enough left over to run your business. You can save your sister's life right now." The absolute silence that followed his demand was deafening. I looked at my mother, whose eyes were wide with desperate expectation. I looked at my father, who genuinely believed he still had the authority to direct my finances. And then I looked at Chloe, who had stopped sobbing just long enough to look up at me from the floor, a pathetic glimmer of hope shining through her tears. A wave of pure, concentrated disgust washed over me, so intense it made my hands shake. I let out a low, humorless laugh that caused Liam to flinch against the credenza. "Let me make sure I understand this perfectly," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, razor-sharp whisper. "You just found out that this man stole my intellectual property 7 years ago and used his lawyers to threaten and silence me. You just found out that he bankrupted your entire estate. You just found out that he took the secondary mortgage money you leveraged against your own home, and instead of investing it, he bought a beachfront penthouse for a 22-year-old cocktail waitress." I took a slow, deliberate step toward my parents. "He lost the deed to your historic home," I continued, my voice rising in volume with every single word. "He cheated on your precious golden daughter for months. He brought the threat of organized crime directly to your doorstep. And your immediate instinctive response is to demand that I use the money I earned through my own blood, sweat, and tears to pay off his gambling debts. You want me to empty my corporate accounts to save a traitor, just so you do not have to face the embarrassment of your country club friends finding out you are broke." Valerie recoiled as if I had slapped her, clutching her pearl necklace. "You are family, Nia," she cried out, her voice shrill and hysterical. "You have to protect your sister. You have a duty to this family. How can you be so selfish? You have millions of dollars. You can fix this with a single phone call." Selfish, I barked, the word echoing violently off the walls. I spent my entire life being treated like a second-class citizen in this house. You paraded Chloe around like a princess, while you told me my ambitions were a waste of time. You let Dad drain my college fund to buy her a luxury car. You sat back and watched Liam destroy my early career, and you told me I was just jealous of his success. You have never, not for one single second of my life, protected me. I turned my fierce gaze onto my father, who immediately looked away, unable to meet the burning intensity in my eyes. "My money is not your bailout fund," I stated, my tone absolutely final. "My company is not your safety net. I will not spend a single red cent of my fortune to save a man who actively tried to ruin my life. Liam dug his own grave, and he can be the one to lie in it. Chloe let out a devastated wail and buried her face back in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently as the last shred of her hope evaporated into the cold air. Nia, please, my father begged, his voice cracking with a pathetic, uncharacteristic weakness. If you do not pay them, they will come here. They will come to this house looking for him. No. Dad, they will not, I corrected him with a cold, triumphant smile. Because, as I mentioned earlier, you are all officially trespassing on my private property, and I am issuing an immediate eviction. I turned to Liam, who was staring at me with wide, terrified eyes, looking like a man who was already dead. You have 30 days to get your belongings out of my house, I told him, my voice devoid of any mercy or hesitation. But considering the people you owe money to, I highly suggest you start running tonight. Because I am not paying your debt, Liam. I am going to sit back, drink a very expensive glass of wine, and watch the consequences of your actions finally catch up to you. Chloe let out another agonizing theatrical wail from the floor, curling her body inward as she clutched a crumpled photograph of her husband to her chest. She rocked back and forth, the very picture of a devastated, betrayed wife whose entire world had just been unjustly torn apart by a monster. My mother knelt beside her, ignoring the shards of broken crystal digging into her knees, wrapping her arms around her golden child and stroking her hair. "Oh, my poor baby," Valerie cooed, shooting a venomous glare up at me. "Look what you have done, Nia. Look at the pain you are causing your own sister. Are you satisfied now? Are you happy you destroyed her life just to prove a point?" I stared down at the two of them, the stark overhead lighting casting harsh, jagged shadows across their faces. The dining room felt entirely devoid of warmth, stripped down to nothing but raw, ugly truths. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. In fact, a deep, resonant disgust settled into my bones as I watched Chloe bury her face in our mother's shoulder, playing the innocent victim to absolute perfection. "You can stop the performance now, Chloe," I said, my voice slicing through her manufactured sobs with the precision of a scalpel. "You are putting on a magnificent show for Mom and Dad, but you and I both know you are not a victim." Chloe froze. Her sobs hitched in her throat. She slowly lifted her head, her mascara running down her cheeks in dark, jagged streaks. She looked at me with a sudden, sharp flash of panic that entirely betrayed her innocent act. Valerie immediately bristled, pulling Chloe closer. "How dare you speak to her that way?" Valerie snapped, her voice trembling with righteous indignation. "She just found out her husband is a cheating criminal fraud. She is entirely innocent in this. She had no idea." I did not break eye contact with my sister as I reached back into the thick manila folder resting on the table. There was one last document tucked inside the heavy paper sleeve. I pulled it out slowly, letting the silence in the room stretch until it became physically uncomfortable. "Did you really have no idea, Chloe?" I asked, my tone dropping to a deadly quiet register. "Did Liam really manage to hide $2 million of syndicate debt and a secondary mortgage from the woman who scrutinizes every single bank statement to ensure she can afford her monthly country club dues?" Chloe scrambled backward on the floor, putting distance between herself and the document in my hand. "Nia, shut up," she hissed, her voice suddenly devoid of any tears. "Just shut up. Do not do this." "Do what I asked," taking a slow step around the shattered china. "Tell them the truth. Tell them that you knew about the Chicago syndicate 6 months ago. Tell them that you were fully aware Liam was drowning in debt, but you explicitly forbade him from declaring bankruptcy because it would ruin your pristine, wealthy influencer aesthetic on social media." My father turned his head, his bloodshot eyes locking onto Chloe. "What is she talking about?" Marcus rasped, his voice sounding like dry gravel. "Chloe, did you know about the loans?" "She is lying?" Chloe screamed, scrambling to her feet and pointing a shaking finger at me. "She is just trying to make me look bad. Liam lied to me. He hid everything." Liam, who was still pinned against the mahogany credenza, let out a harsh, bitter bark of laughter. He wiped the blood from his scratched cheek and glared at his wife with pure malice. The solidarity of their fraudulent marriage had completely evaporated. "Do not play the victim now, Chloe," Liam sneered, throwing her directly under the bus to save whatever shred of dignity he had left. You knew exactly how deep in the hole we were. When the bank threatened to repossess the cars, you were the one who told me to find private lenders. You told me you would rather die than be seen driving a leased sedan in front of your friends. You knew where that money came from. Valerie let out a confused, breathless gasp, looking between her golden daughter and her disgraced son-in-law. Chloe, is this true? Valerie asked, her voice cracking. You knew he leveraged our house. You knew he was dealing with criminals. I did not let Chloe answer. I walked directly up to my mother and held out the final document. It was a bank statement accompanied by a high-resolution scan of a wire transfer authorization form. She did not just know about the criminals, Mom, I stated, my voice echoing with brutal, undeniable clarity. She actively helped him steal from you to pay them off. Valerie stared at the paper in my hand, but made no move to take it. Her entire body was trembling. What are you talking about? She whispered, her eyes wide with a creeping, uncomprehending terror. Liam took the money from the house. Liam bankrupted the estate. Liam took the equity from the house. I corrected her, my gaze locked onto my mother's terrified face, but that was not enough to cover his losses and fund his mistress. When the syndicate demanded their first major repayment 3 months ago, Liam was completely tapped out. The bank accounts were empty. So Chloe decided to solve the problem herself. I dropped the wire transfer authorization directly onto my mother's lap. Look at the account number, Mom, I commanded. Look at the origin of those funds. Valerie slowly lowered her eyes to the paper. Her hands shook so violently she could barely hold the document steady. She read the bold black text, her lips moving silently, as she processed the numbers. It was the routing information for her private, untouchable retirement account. The one she had built over 40 years separate from my father's business assets. $500,000, I read aloud, making sure my father heard every single syllable. A clean, even $500,000 transferred out of a high-yield retirement fund and wired directly to an offshore shell account controlled by the Chicago syndicate. Valerie gasped, clutching her chest. No, she whimpered, shaking her head in frantic denial. No, I never authorized this. I never signed a transfer. The bank would never release those funds without my signature. I leaned down, placing my finger directly on the bottom right corner of the document. Look at the signature, Mom. Valerie stared at the blue ink scrawled across the authorization line. It looked exactly like her elegant looping cursive. To a bank teller, it was a perfect match. But to a mother, to a family member who knew the subtle slants and pressures of that handwriting, the truth was glaringly obvious. That is your signature, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. But you did not sign it, did you? My mother's breathing became ragged. She looked up from the paper and slowly turned her head toward Chloe. Her golden child. The daughter she had elevated above all others. The daughter she had praised, pampered, and protected at the expense of my own sanity. Chloe was backing away toward the hallway, her face completely drained of color, her eyes wide with the panicked realization that she was entirely trapped. She shook her head, holding her hands up defensively. Mom, I had to, Chloe pleaded, her voice cracking into a pathetic whine. They were going to hurt Liam. They were going to take the cars. I was just borrowing it. I swear I was going to put it back as soon as Liam's next deal closed. I was protecting the family. You forged my signature. Valerie whispered the words, barely making it past her lips. Her voice was completely devoid of its usual arrogant command. It was the sound of a woman whose heart had just been physically crushed. You stole my retirement money. You stole my future. I did it for us, Chloe cried, tears of genuine panic finally spilling down her cheeks. You always told me to maintain our image. You told me that perception is everything. If people found out we were broke, we would be ruined. I did exactly what you taught me to do. The profound cruelty of Chloe's justification struck my mother like a physical blow. The absolute realization that her years of shallow image-obsessed parenting had created a monster willing to cannibalize her own mother's future just to buy a few more months of fake luxury. Valerie stared at her favorite daughter, her chest heaving as she struggled to pull air into her lungs. "Valerie!" my father yelled, finally snapping out of his shock as he saw my mother's eyes roll backward. But he was too late. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal, the compounding shock of losing her home, discovering her son-in-law's crimes, and finally realizing that her beloved daughter had actively forged her signature to rob her blind was simply too much for her mind to process. Valerie let out a weak, strangled gasp. Her eyes fluttered closed, her knees buckled completely, and she collapsed hard against the hardwood floor, slipping into absolute unconsciousness. Marcus dropped to his knees beside her, frantically shaking her shoulders and screaming her name. Chloe stood frozen against the wall, her hands covering her mouth, staring in horror at the limp body of the mother she had just destroyed. I stood completely still, looking down at the chaotic, ruined remnants of the Wilson family. I felt no urge to kneel. I felt no urge to comfort them. I simply watched the inevitable collapse of an empire built entirely on lies, greed, and toxic favoritism, knowing that I was the one who finally handed them the mirror. The heavy steel box hit the pristine marble with a dull, resounding thud that seemed to shake the very foundation of the room. The sound cut through the chaotic aftermath of my mother's collapse and my father's frantic attempts to revive her. The camera of my memory pulled back, taking in the wide, pathetic scope of their destruction, before moving slowly and steadily right back to me. I stood at the head of the table, completely rooted in my absolute authority. I did not flinch. I did not offer to call an ambulance. I simply raised my right hand and gave a sharp, silent snap of my fingers. From the dark shadows of the grand foyer, two men stepped into the dining room. They were towering, broad-shouldered security contractors I had hired weeks ago, dressed in immaculate dark suits. My family had been so consumed by their own shouting and theatrical performing that they had not even noticed the security detail standing guard at the front entrance. One of the men walked directly to my side. He was the one who had placed the reinforced steel lockbox onto the table. My father looked up from my mother's unconscious body, his eyes wide and uncomprehending. Chloe pressed her back against the wall, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Liam remained frozen against the credenza, his face pale and slick with terrified sweat. "You really thought I was finished?" I asked, my voice carrying the steady, resonant calm of an executioner delivering the final verdict. "You thought evicting you and exposing your miserable infidelities was the end of this transaction." I reached forward and unlocked the steel box. The heavy lid popped open. Inside sat three massive, professionally bound legal dossiers. They were thick with highlighted bank statements, offshore routing numbers, and certified transcripts. When my acquisition firm took over this property, I explained, resting my hand flat on top of the files, we did not just find the syndicate debt. My forensic accounting team spent the last month tracing every single dollar that moved through Liam Sterling's failed company, as well as the personal joint accounts held by Liam and Chloe Sterling. We traced the fraudulent loans. We traced the shell company in Florida. We traced the money you funneled through crypto exchanges to hide it from your domestic creditors. I pulled out the first thick dossier and dropped it onto the table. "This is the complete record of your wire fraud," I stated, looking directly at Liam. "You crossed state lines to purchase property with fraudulently obtained funds. You falsified corporate earnings reports to secure secondary bridge loans from private investors." I pulled out the second dossier and dropped it heavily next to the first. "This is the documentation of your federal tax evasion." I continued, shifting my gaze to my sister, who looked as if she might violently throw up. "You signed joint returns for the past 4 years, Chloe. You knowingly claimed massive corporate losses while simultaneously hiding millions in unreported income and luxury assets. You actively participated in a conspiracy to defraud the federal government." And finally, I pulled out the third folder. It was thinner, but infinitely more damning. "And this," I said, tapping the heavy paper, "is the undeniable proof of Chloe forging our mother's signature to steal $500,000. It includes the IP address logs from the computer used to authorize the transfer, which happens to match the IP address of your own home network." The color drained completely from Liam's face. The mob was a terrifying problem, but they were a problem he foolishly thought he could run away from. The federal government, however, was an entirely different beast. Federal prison meant the absolute end of his life. It meant jumpsuits, concrete cells, and decades behind bars with no possibility of parole. These dossiers are not for my personal amusement, I announced, stepping back and gesturing to the metal box. My corporate legal team has spent the entire weekend preparing them. On Monday morning at exactly 8 o'clock, multiple couriers will deliver these exact files to the regional director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the White Collar Crime Division, and the Criminal Investigation Unit of the Internal Revenue Service. Chloe dropped to her knees. Her legs simply gave out. She clasped her hands together in a prayerful, desperate gesture. "Nia, no!" she wailed, her voice tearing from her throat in a raw, animalistic screech. "Please, I will do anything. I will work for you. I will clean your house. Do not send me to prison. Please, Nia, I am your sister." I looked down at her, feeling absolutely nothing. "You ceased being my sister the day you decided my life was worth sacrificing for your aesthetic," I replied coldly. "You made your choices. Now you get to live with the federal consequences." Something inside Liam completely snapped. The polished, manipulative con artist evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a cornered, desperate animal. He let out a furious, guttural roar. His eyes locked onto the steel box. In his panicked mind, destroying those files was his only chance at survival. He lunged forward with a sudden, explosive burst of speed. His hands reached out, his fingers clawing frantically through the air toward the dossiers on the marble table. He never even made it halfway. My security contractors reacted with terrifying, instantaneous precision. The bodyguard standing to my left stepped forward, intercepting Liam's charge effortlessly. He grabbed Liam by the back of his expensive designer jacket and the scruff of his neck. With a single brutal twist of leverage, the bodyguard completely overpowered him. Liam let out a sharp cry of pain as his arms were violently wrenched behind his back. The second bodyguard stepped in, grabbing Liam's shoulders and forcing him downward. They slammed him directly onto the dining table. Liam's face hit the table with a sickening smack. But he did not just hit the marble. The bodyguards pinned him face first, right into the center of the ruined Thanksgiving spread. His cheek and nose smashed directly into the massive, greasy tray holding the remnants of the roasted turkey. Thick brown gravy splashed across his face, soaking into his hair and ruining his custom-tailored collar. Cranberry sauce and stuffing smeared across his forehead as he thrashed wildly against the unrelenting grip of the two massive men holding him down. "Get off me!" Liam muffled into the turkey carcass, his voice bubbling through a mouthful of grease and gravy. "Let me go! I will kill you! Let me go!" "Hold him there," I commanded calmly, my voice steady and unwavering. The bodyguards applied more pressure, driving Liam's face deeper into the ruined dinner. He kicked his legs, his polished dress shoes slipping uselessly against the hardwood floor, but he was entirely trapped. He was completely pinned down, humiliated, and reduced to a thrashing, gravy-covered mess in the center of the home he had tried to steal. I stepped closer to the table, looking down at the side of his smeared, greasy face. "You are not going anywhere, Liam," I said, my voice dropping to a low, commanding register that forced him to stop thrashing and listen. "You thought you could outsmart everyone. You thought you could steal my work, steal my parents' money, and run away to Miami with your mistress. But you are incredibly stupid. You left a digital paper trail a mile wide, and you underestimated the exact person you should have feared the most." My father was still sitting on the floor, holding my mother's head, staring up at the scene in absolute shock. Marcus had ruled his business and his family through intimidation for decades, but seeing Liam completely neutralized and physically dominated by my security team stripped away his remaining bravado. He realized finally and irreversibly that I was the one holding all the power. Chloe remained on her knees, her face buried in her hands, her body rocking back and forth as she muttered incomprehensible pleas. The reality of federal prison had completely broken her mind. I tapped the steel box with my fingernail, the sharp clicking sound echoing through the silent, tense room. "There is no escape from this," I announced, addressing both Liam and Chloe. "You cannot charm your way out of wire fraud. You cannot post a crying video on social media to escape the IRS. They are going to freeze every single bank account you own by Tuesday." They are going to seize the penthouse in Miami. They are going to take your cars, your jewelry, and your fraudulent dignity, and then they are going to put you both in handcuffs. I leaned down, bringing my face just inches away from Liam's ear. He was breathing heavily, blowing bubbles of gravy from his lips, his eyes wide with wild, unadulterated panic. "Enjoy your last weekend of freedom, Liam," I whispered coldly, "because come Monday morning, the only thing you will be managing is your commissary account." I stood up straight and looked at my bodyguards. "Let him up," I ordered. They immediately released their grip and stepped back, their faces completely impassive. Liam gasped for air, pushing himself off the table. He stumbled backward, slipping on the spilled ice water. His face was a horrific, humiliating mask of turkey grease, mashed potatoes, and brown gravy. He wiped frantically at his eyes, smearing the mess further into his hair. He looked absolutely pathetic. "Get out of my house," I commanded, pointing a rigid finger directly at the front door. "All of you. Take your unconscious mother, grab your coats, and get off my property right now. If any of you are still inside this house in 5 minutes, my security team will drag you out to the curb and leave you in the driveway." "Wait," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy, suffocating air of the dining room like a crack of a whip. Liam froze mid-step, his gravy-soaked dress shoes slipping on the polished hardwood. He had been practically crawling toward the grand archway of the foyer, desperate to escape the room, to escape me. At my command, the two massive security contractors instantly stepped sideways, forming an impenetrable wall of muscle and dark fabric right across his only exit. Liam flinched, shrinking back against the ruined mahogany credenza, his breath rattling in his chest. I took my time crossing the room. Every step I took resonated with a slow, deliberate click of my heels against the floorboards. The sound was deafening in the absolute silence of the house. My father remained completely paralyzed beside my unconscious mother. Chloe was still on her knees, her tear-streaked face staring blankly at the floor. The power dynamic in the room had entirely shifted, settling permanently and squarely onto my shoulders. I was no longer the outcast daughter. I was the executioner. I stopped directly in front of Liam. He was a pathetic, wretched sight. His expensive designer shirt was stained brown with turkey grease. His perfectly styled hair was matted to his forehead, and a thin line of blood trickled from a scratch on his cheek where the crystal had caught him. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and completely stripped of the arrogant, condescending light that had defined his entire existence. From his perspective on the floor, I towered over him, an absolute force of nature that had systematically dismantled his entire life in under 20 minutes. I crouched down smoothly, bringing my face level with his, though my posture remained perfectly straight and unyielding. The smell of his fear was palpable, a sour metallic scent that mixed with the ruined holiday dinner. I leaned forward, closing the distance until I was mere inches from his ear. When I spoke, my voice was a deadly, vibrating whisper carrying a promise of absolute destruction. "I told the family they had 30 days to vacate my property," I murmured softly, making sure he heard every single syllable. "But that timeline does not apply to you. Your timeline is significantly shorter. You have exactly 10 minutes. Liam let out a shaky, pathetic gasp, his chest heaving as he stared at me in terror. 10 minutes to walk upstairs under the supervision of my security detail. I continued, my eyes locking onto his panicked gaze. "You will pack whatever fits into one single duffel bag. You will walk out the front door, and you will leave this state tonight. You are never coming back. You will never set foot in Massachusetts again. You will never call my sister. You will never text her. You will never attempt to contact your children. You are going to evaporate into thin air, Liam." He swallowed hard, a bubble of gravy popping near his lip. "Nia, please," he whimpered, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate whine. "I have nothing. Where am I supposed to go?" "The syndicate, they will find me." "That sounds like a spectacular personal problem," I replied, my tone completely devoid of mercy. "If you stay here, they will definitely find you. If you run, maybe you survive. But let me make one thing absolutely crystal clear. If I ever see your face again, if my security team catches wind that you have crossed state lines, or if you so much as send a carrier pigeon to Chloe or the kids, I will not hesitate. I will personally hand-deliver this steel box to the FBI. I will hand the financial ledgers to the IRS. I will let the federal government lock you in a concrete box for the rest of your miserable, fraudulent life. Do we have an understanding? Liam stared at me, his mind racing as he calculated his non-existent options. The facade of the brilliant tech entrepreneur, the wealthy husband, the beloved son-in-law, was entirely gone. Beneath all the tailored suits and country club memberships, Liam Sterling was nothing but a cowardly, self-serving parasite. He did not care about the syndicate tearing his family apart. He did not care about the trauma he had inflicted on his wife. He only cared about saving his own skin. Yes. He gasped out, his head bobbing up and down in frantic, pathetic agreement. Yes, I understand. 10 minutes. I will leave. I will go. Just do not give them the files, please. Do not give them the files. I smiled, a cold, clinical expression that did not reach my eyes. Good. But there is one final piece of administrative housekeeping before you run away. I stood up, smoothing the front of my blazer, and reached into the interior pocket. I pulled out a crisp, folded legal document and a heavy silver fountain pen. My corporate lawyers had been incredibly thorough when we planned this acquisition. They knew exactly how a rat like Liam would react when cornered. I dropped the document directly onto the floor in front of him. Sign it, I commanded. Liam scrambled forward on his hands and knees, his greasy fingers fumbling to pick up the paper. He squinted at the bold legal heading at the top of the page. It was a voluntary, irrevocable relinquishment of parental rights. It effectively stripped him of any legal claim, custody, or visitation rights to his niece and nephew. It severed his legal ties to his children completely and permanently. A normal father, even a flawed one, would have hesitated. A normal man would have argued, begged, or shown at least a fraction of remorse at the prospect of losing his children forever. Liam did not even read the second paragraph. He snatched the silver pen from my outstretched hand with trembling fingers. Without a single word of protest, without glancing over at his weeping wife, he pressed the paper against the hardwood floor. His hand shook so violently that the pen tore slightly through the heavy stock paper as he hastily scrawled his signature across the bottom line. He signed away his children with the exact same frantic speed he had used to steal my intellectual property 7 years ago. He shoved the paper and the pen back toward my feet, looking up at me with wide, desperate eyes, waiting for permission to flee. I picked up the document, checking the signature, and slipped it safely back into my jacket. I looked at the 2 security guards flanking the doorway. Escort Mr. Sterling upstairs, I instructed them. Start a timer. 10 minutes. 1 bag. Do not let him take anything of significant value. If he takes longer than 10 minutes, throw him out the front door exactly as he is. The guards moved with terrifying efficiency. They reached down, grabbing Liam by the armpits, and hauled him to his feet like a rag doll. Liam did not resist. He stumbled forward, his legs shaking as the guards marched him aggressively toward the grand staircase. I stood in the dining room listening to the heavy, frantic thud of his footsteps pounding up the wooden stairs. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked loudly, marking the countdown of his complete erasure from our lives. The silence that settled over the dining room in his absence was heavy and absolute. I turned my attention back to my sister. Chloe was still kneeling on the floor. She had watched the entire exchange. She had watched her husband, the man she had built her entire identity around, sign away their children without a moment of hesitation to save himself. She had watched him agree to abandon her forever, just to avoid a federal prison sentence. The absolute cowardice of it had paralyzed her. She stared at the empty archway where Liam had just disappeared, her mouth slightly open, her eyes vacant and hollow. The illusion was dead. The man she thought was a king was nothing but a sniveling, desperate thief who would gladly throw her to the wolves to buy his own freedom. Nia, my father whispered, his voice cracking in the quiet room. He was still kneeling beside my mother, his hand resting on her chest to ensure she was breathing. You cannot do this. You cannot just exile him. The kids. What are we going to tell the kids? You will tell them that their father is a criminal who ran away, I replied, my voice hard and uncompromising. You will tell them the truth, Dad. For the first time in your life, you are going to stop hiding behind fake prestige and country club gossip, and you are going to face reality. Exactly 9 minutes later, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed from the top of the stairs. Liam appeared in the archway, flanked tightly by the two security guards. He was clutching a dark canvas duffel bag to his chest. He had thrown a heavy wool overcoat over his ruined, gravy-stained shirt, buttoning it up to his chin in a pathetic attempt to hide the mess. He was panting, his face pale, his eyes darting frantically toward the front door. "Liam," Chloe called out. Her voice was weak, raspy, and entirely broken. It was the sound of a woman begging for a single shred of humanity from the person who had destroyed her. "Liam, please." Liam stopped at the bottom of the stairs. He stood less than 10 feet away from his wife. He heard her voice. He knew she was kneeling on the floor, surrounded by the wreckage of their life. He did not even turn his head. He tightened his grip on the duffel bag, lowered his chin, and marched straight toward the heavy oak front door. He did not look at Chloe. He did not look at my father. He practically sprinted down the hallway, pushed the heavy door open, and stepped out into the freezing November night air. The heavy door slammed shut behind him with a resounding final thud that rattled the windows. He was gone. Chloe let out a long, agonizing gasp, her body folding entirely in half as she collapsed onto the floor. The absolute, unadulterated cowardice of his departure was the final nail in the coffin. He had not fought for her. He had not apologized. He had just run. I stood in the center of the room, completely untouched by the devastation. The golden child was weeping on the floor. The manipulative patriarch was kneeling helplessly beside his unconscious, fraudulent wife. The thief had been banished into the cold. My house was finally clean. The echo of the heavy oak front door slamming shut lingered in the air for a long, heavy moment. It was the final pathetic punctuation mark to Liam's cowardice. The silence that settled over the dining room was profound. It was not a peaceful silence. It was the suffocating, ringing quiet of a battlefield after the artillery has stopped firing. I stood at the head of the long marble table, my posture perfectly straight, my hands resting casually on the cool stone surface. I watched the dust settle over the absolute ruins of my family. My father was kneeling on the hardwood floor, his face gray and completely drained of its usual commanding, arrogant color. He was awkwardly attempting to help my mother sit up. Valerie leaned heavily against the wall, her eyes fluttering open, blinking against the harsh, brilliant glare of the crystal chandelier. The aristocratic haughtiness that had defined her entire existence was entirely gone, replaced by a vacant, terrified confusion. She looked down at her shaking hands, then over at the scattered glossy photographs of Liam's mistress, and finally at the forged bank documents that proved her golden daughter had stolen her entire retirement fund. Chloe was a crumpled heap of designer fabric and smeared expensive makeup. She was rocking back and forth on her heels, clutching her arms tightly around her stomach, as if trying to physically hold herself together. Her loud, theatrical sobs had quieted into wet, ragged gasps. She kept glancing at the empty archway leading to the foyer, her eyes wide and panicked, as if hoping Liam would suddenly come rushing back to save her. But he was gone, and she was completely alone, with the terrifying reality of her own actions. Marcus slowly pulled himself to his feet. His knees popped loudly in the quiet room. He leaned heavily against the back of a velvet dining chair, looking at me with bloodshot, defeated eyes. He tried to straighten his shoulders, tried to summon the ghost of the terrifying patriarch he used to be, but the posture immediately crumbled. Nia Marcus started, his voice raspy and incredibly weak. "You have made your point. You exposed him. The man is gone. We are a family in crisis. Your mother is ill. Chloe is devastated. We need to stop this madness and figure out how to survive this scandal. We need to pool our resources." I tilted my head, looking at him with a cold, clinical detachment that made him visibly flinch. "Do not mistake my clearing the trash out of my house for an act of family solidarity, Dad," I replied, my voice slicing through the room like a freshly sharpened blade. "There is no collective group here to figure this out. There is only you dealing with the devastating consequences of your own catastrophic blindness." Valerie let out a weak whimper, pressing her hands to her pale face. My friends, she cried, her voice trembling with absolute horror. The country club, the charity board. When the federal agents freeze those accounts, everyone will know. It will be on the local news. We will be ruined. I will never be able to show my face in high society again. Society does not care about you, Mom, I stated plainly, offering her no comfort whatsoever. By Monday afternoon, your country club friends will pretend they never knew you. They will delete your number from their phones to avoid being associated with a federal fraud investigation. Your social standing is completely dead. Your retirement fund was stolen by your favorite daughter. Your husband bankrupted the estate to save a criminal. You have absolutely nothing left but the reality you spent your entire life trying to avoid. I stepped away from the table, my heels clicking sharply and rhythmically against the floorboards as I walked toward my parents. Marcus tensed, clearly expecting me to order my security guards to drag them out into the driveway right then and there. I stopped a few feet away, looking down at their ruined expressions. Because you are blood, I will not order my security team to throw you out into the freezing cold tonight. I announced, my words ringing with absolute, unyielding authority. You can sleep in your beds. You can stay through the weekend. But do not confuse my basic human decency with forgiveness. Starting tomorrow morning, my legal team will deliver a standard residential lease agreement. Marcus stared at me, completely uncomprehending. A lease agreement? He repeated numbly. For what? For this house, Dad, I answered, a sharp, genuinely amused smile playing on my lips. You seem to keep forgetting that you no longer own this property. I do. If you wish to continue residing in this historic brownstone, you will sign that lease, and you will pay me market rate rent on the first of every single month. If you fail to pay, or if you refuse to sign it, I will begin formal eviction proceedings immediately. Pay rent! Valerie gasped, struggling to pull herself up from the floor, her eyes wide with shock. To our own daughter, Nia. How can you demand money from us? We are broke. We have nothing left. How are we supposed to pay market rate rent on a 6-bedroom mansion? That sounds like a spectacular problem for you to solve, I replied effortlessly, crossing my arms. Perhaps you can downsize. I hear the apartments on the east side of town are very affordable. Or perhaps Dad can come out of retirement and get a job managing a retail store. I am a landlord, Mom. I am not a charity. I turned my back on their stunned, horrified faces and walked over to where Chloe was kneeling. She looked up at me, her eyes wide, bloodshot, and overflowing with fresh tears. Without Liam, without her mother's stolen money, she was entirely defenseless. For a brief, pathetic moment, I saw a flicker of genuine hope in her eyes. She thought that because I had banished her terrible husband, I was somehow back on her side. She thought the big bad older sister was going to wrap her arms around her and promise to protect her from the fallout. Nia, Chloe whimpered, reaching out a trembling hand to grasp the hem of my tailored blazer. Please, I have nothing. Liam took the car keys. He took the cash from the safe. I do not know how I am going to feed the kids. I do not know how I am going to pay for their private school. You have to help me. You have all that money from your company. You can help me hire a lawyer to fight him. I looked down at her hand, clutching my jacket. I did not pull away. I just stared at it until she felt the absolute freezing coldness radiating from me and slowly let go her hand, dropping limply back to the floor. I am not giving you a single dime, Chloe, I said, my voice dangerously quiet but echoing loudly in her ears. You helped your husband steal $500,000 from our mother so you could keep posting pictures of designer bags on the internet. You lied to my face tonight. You demanded that I buy you a mansion with money you thought you deserved just for existing. You are a fraud, and you are exactly as guilty as he is. Chloe shook her head violently, throwing her hands up in the air. I was scared, she sobbed, her voice pitching upward into a hysterical whine. I did not know what to do. He told me they were going to hurt him. What am I supposed to do now? You are going to do exactly what millions of actual adults do every single day. I commanded, stepping closer and forcing her to look up at my unyielding face. And Chloe, your credit cards are locked. The federal government is freezing every joint account connected to Liam's name. You cannot buy your way out of this. Start looking for a job immediately. because there is no one left to clean up your mess. A job? Chloe gasped, her face twisting in pure horror, as if I had just suggested she cut off her own arm. Nia. I have never worked. I do not have a degree. I do not have any skills. I cannot work in an office. I do not even know how to use a copy machine. What kind of job am I supposed to get? I hear the local coffee shop is hiring baristas, I suggested with a dark, deeply satisfied amusement. Or perhaps you can find a job bagging groceries at the supermarket down the street. It is honest work. It builds character, something you are entirely lacking. Chloe stared at me, her mouth opening and closing as the terrifying reality of minimum wage and manual labor finally broke through her lifelong delusion of grandeur. She looked over at my parents, silently begging them to intervene, begging them to tell me to stop being so cruel. But Marcus and Valerie just looked away. They had no power left to save her. They could not even save themselves. I stepped back, taking in the full, glorious picture of their absolute defeat. The mighty Marcus Wilson reduced to a desperate, impoverished tenant in a house he once ruled. The aristocratic Valerie ruined, socially exiled, and stripped of her stolen wealth by her own flesh and blood. The golden child Chloe, facing the terrifying, unavoidable reality of getting a minimum wage job. I turned toward the foyer, signaling to my security detail that we were completely finished here. The two men fell into step behind me as I walked out of the dining room. Read the lease carefully when it arrives tomorrow, I called out over my shoulder, not bothering to look back at the wreckage. I require a strict security deposit, and I am entirely unforgiving when it comes to late fees. I had barely made it 2 steps toward the grand foyer when I heard the frantic scrambling sound of footsteps rushing across the hardwood floor behind me. "Nia, wait!" my father called out. His voice cracked, carrying a desperate pleading tone I had never once heard him use in my entire life. Before I could even turn around, both Marcus and Valerie were practically throwing themselves at me. My mother's face was streaked with dark running mascara, her perfectly styled hair now a disheveled, chaotic mess. They reached out simultaneously, their hands grasping for my arms, attempting to pull me into a frantic, tearful embrace. They wanted to hold me, to physically restrain me from walking out the door and sealing their fate. "We are so sorry," Valerie sobbed, her fingers clawing desperately at the sleeve of my blazer. "Please, Nia, you have to believe us. We always loved you. We did. We just did not know how to show it. We were blind, but we love you so much. You are our daughter." Marcus nodded vigorously, tears finally spilling over his eyelashes and tracking down his weathered cheeks. "We made terrible mistakes with you, Nia. We see that now. We were wrong. But you cannot do this. You cannot throw your family away. We can fix this. Just give us a chance to be the parents you always needed. We can start over." I stood completely still. I did not flinch. I did not soften. I kept my posture rigid and my gaze locked onto them precisely at eye level. The profound, unshakable calm radiating through my chest served as the ultimate armor against their pathetic, incredibly belated performance. I looked down at their hands, clutching my jacket hands that had never once offered me genuine comfort, support, or affection when I was actually suffering. I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical disgust. I took a deliberate step back, raising my arms and brushing their hands away with a sharp, uncompromising motion that severed their physical contact instantly. "Do not touch me," I stated, my voice echoing through the cavernous foyer with freezing clarity. "You do not get to play the loving parents now that you have run out of options. Your love always came with conditions, with price tags, and with endless calculated humiliation." Valerie let out a wounded, breathless gasp, covering her mouth with her trembling hands, as if I had physically struck her across the face. But I was not finished. I had 30 years of suppressed truth to deliver, and I was going to make sure they heard every single word. "You do not love me," I continued, my eyes boring directly into my father's terrified stare. "You love the money and the power you think I can still offer you. I spent 3 decades begging to be seen in this house. I worked myself to the bone to earn a fraction of the respect you freely handed to a sociopath and her criminal husband. You ignored my existence so you could cater to Chloe's every whim. You let Liam steal your future because maintaining a perfect, wealthy image for your country club friends was infinitely more important to you than actual family loyalty. My parents stood frozen, the brutal honesty of my words pinning them to the spot. They had no counter-arguments left. The truth was glaringly obvious, reflected in the ruined dining room just a few feet away. I do not need this fake Thanksgiving anymore, I declared, my tone utterly devoid of sympathy. I do not need your fake apologies, and I certainly do not need your fake love. My dinner is over. I turned smoothly on my heel, dismissing them from my sight, and walked directly to the antique mahogany coat rack near the front door. I lifted my heavy tailored designer cashmere coat from the brass hook and slipped it over my shoulders. I adjusted the lapels with deliberate, measured precision, smoothing out the expensive fabric. I could feel the heavy weight of their desperate, terrified stares burning into my back, but I refused to give them another ounce of my emotional energy. I signaled to my lead security contractor, who immediately stepped forward, his posture rigid and attentive. You and your team will remain stationed inside the house until Monday morning. I instructed him, speaking loudly and clearly so that my parents and Chloe could hear every single syllable of my final mandate. You will monitor every exit. No one is to leave this property with anything other than personal clothing and basic toiletries. If anyone attempts to remove artwork, jewelry, electronics, silver, or any valuable assets belonging to the estate, you are to stop them physically and call the police immediately to report a theft. Understood, Ms. Wilson, the guard replied instantly, crossing his arms and taking a firm, intimidating stance directly inside the foyer. I looked back at the ruined remnants of the Wilson family one final time. It was a sweeping, cinematic view of complete devastation. Marcus was holding up a sobbing Valerie, both of them looking older and more fragile than they ever had. Chloe was still curled in a pathetic ball on the dining room floor, utterly paralyzed by her impending federal charges and the terrifying reality of poverty. It was a masterpiece of absolute destruction, a portrait painted entirely by their own limitless greed and toxic favoritism. I reached out, grasped the heavy brass handle of the front door, and pulled it open. The crisp, freezing November air rushed into the foyer, biting against my face. I stepped out onto the porch, pulling my coat tighter around my shoulders, and left them entirely alone in the beautiful empty cage they had built for themselves. The heavy, solid oak front door clicked shut behind me, instantly cutting off the muffled, pathetic sounds of my family's collective breakdown. The sudden silence was absolute and profound. I stood alone on the expansive brick porch, the biting, crisp cold of the Atlanta November night washing over my face. I closed my eyes and drew in a long, deep breath. The air tasted sharp, carrying the faint, smoky scent of neighborhood fireplaces and winter frost. It tasted like pure, unadulterated freedom. For 30 years, crossing this threshold had meant bracing myself for an onslaught of passive-aggressive insults, endless comparisons, and toxic manipulation. For 30 years, this house had been a suffocating prison where my worth was constantly measured and aggressively found wanting. But tonight, I had not just broken out of the cage. I had bought the entire property, evicted the warden, and burned their fraudulent legacy straight to the ground. There were absolutely no tears welling in my eyes. There was no lingering guilt knotting in my chest. There was only a vast, serene stillness. The monumental weight I had carried since childhood had been completely lifted, replaced by a core of unbreakable titanium. I opened my eyes and began to descend the wide, sweeping brick steps leading down to the circular driveway. My heels clicked rhythmically against the stone, a steady, triumphant metronome in the quiet night. The camera of my reality seemed to glide backward, pulling away smoothly, capturing the grand, imposing facade of the historic brownstone that now belonged entirely to me and the lone victorious woman walking away from it. As I reached the bottom step, a pair of brilliant LED headlights swept gracefully through the wrought iron front gates. A sleek, midnight black Mercedes Maybach glided silently up the driveway, its tires crunching softly against the gravel. The vehicle pulled to a smooth, immaculate stop exactly where I was standing. My personal driver, dressed in an impeccable dark suit, stepped out immediately. He walked around the rear of the luxury sedan with practiced efficiency and opened the heavy passenger door for me. He gave a respectful, silent nod, holding his arm out to guide my way. I paused before stepping inside. The plush, illuminated interior of the Maybach bathed me in a soft, warm glow. Resting securely in the center console was a crystal ice bucket holding a perfectly chilled bottle of vintage champagne and a single waiting flute. I did not get in right away. Instead, I slowly turned my body around, looking directly forward, as if locking eyes with the very universe that had once tried to crush me. I let a slow, radiant smile spread across my face. It was not a smile of survival. It was a smile of absolute, unconquerable power. They thought they could trample me forever because I was the outcast child. I said, my voice cutting through the quiet night air with lethal, magnificent clarity. They thought my silence was weakness. They thought my distance was defeat. I reached into the car, my manicured fingers wrapping around the neck of the chilled champagne bottle. I popped the cork with a crisp, satisfying snap that echoed loudly across the empty driveway. I poured the golden bubbling liquid into the crystal flute, watching it fizz and spark in the ambient light. But they forgot one thing. I continued, my smile sharpening into something dangerous and undeniably triumphant. The black sheep of the family is usually the only one who sees through the wolves. I picked up the crystal glass, the cool weight of it grounding me in this perfect, flawless reality. And when that black sheep has $15 million, a heart of stone, and carefully kept receipts, I declared, locking my unwavering gaze dead ahead, that is no longer a tragedy. That is a perfect revenge. I raised the champagne glass high, offering a mock toast to the ruined brownstone, to the disgraced golden child, to the dethroned patriarch, and to every single person who had ever dared to underestimate me. Happy Thanksgiving. I brought the glass to my lips, took a long, deeply satisfying sip of the sweet vintage, and lowered myself gracefully into the plush leather seat of the Maybach. My driver closed the door with a solid, definitive thud, sealing me inside my own immaculate world. The powerful engine purred to life. The Maybach pulled smoothly away from the curb, gliding past the towering iron gates of the estate and turning out onto the main road. I sank back against the luxurious headrest, watching through the tinted windows as the vibrant, glowing city lights of Atlanta blurred past me in a brilliant streak of color. The screen of my past faded entirely, swallowed by the darkness, leaving nothing behind but the limitless, blinding light of my future.